So it's my pleasure to welcome you to this third panel that looks at the history of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. I'm Deborah Moore, and I wanted to take a leaf from Sam Norich and begin with thank yous to everyone who organized the sessions. I think they've really been very interesting. One of the things that you will get to hear this afternoon is what happens once we leave the post-war period, which I think is really important. Indeed, I don't think YIVO would be here celebrating 100 years if it were not for the changes that occurred in the mid-70s, and then much later, when whole new generations of young people who become scholars, who come to shape the field, enter the orbit of YIVO, some of them staying within that orbit, and others of them moving out to build other institutional venues for it. And I want to start with just a small personal reflection. I completed in 1975 my dissertation, and Michael Herzog was the outsider on my committee. And I guess he liked what he read because he invited me to offer a course in the Max Weinreich Center, Graduate Center, that had been established not that long ago. The course was going to be on, and was on, history of Jewish immigration to the United States. The course went very well. There were some number of really wonderful scholars who later went on to do great work, not necessarily because of the course, but that was part of their training. I did a second course on second-generation Jews in New York City as well, and it was the invitation of Michael Herzog that brought me to the YIVO. And I think that that personal connection is an important piece of what starts to expand the range of the YIVO in the United States as it seeks to not just reestablish itself, but to become an influence within the world of Jewish studies more broadly. So the first presenter today, this afternoon, is Anita Norich. You have a really nice description. She's a former colleague at the University of Michigan. I want to just point out a couple of her wonderful translations into English, starting with A Jewish Refugee in New York by Kadya Molodowsky, and followed by Fear and Other Stories by Hannah Blankstein, and most recently, Desires by Celia Dropkin. She's going to speak about Yiddish graduates.
Thanks. You'll be happy to know that I don't have a PowerPoint. The disadvantage of coming so late in a conference like this is that you've probably heard a lot of what I'm going to say. The advantage is that maybe because you've heard a lot of what I'm going to say from other people, you're more likely to believe it. So let's see. Let's see if that's true. In 1942, the poet and partisan fighter Shmerke Kaczynski wrote the now famous line, Nein, wir wollen keinmal sein letzte Mohikane. No, we will never be the last of the Mohicans. That's both a defiant proclamation and one you only need to proclaim when that's exactly what you fear becoming, the last of a group, an ideology, a belief system, a people. YIVO was, at least in part, founded on that fear. But post-war, Yiddish scholars tended increasingly to claim being the last of the Mohicans as a lament, but also as a badge of honor. The last to be born in Eastern Europe, raised in a Yiddish-speaking community, the last to attend Yiddish shulas, the last to be native speakers. During the first international Yiddish conference I attended, it wasn't here but in Oxford, I was told about all the things that would make it impossible for me to become a scholar and teacher of Yiddish. I've referred to these disqualifications in the past as the 3 Gs of post-war Yiddish scholarship. On the basis of gender, generation, and geography, I would always be lacking in something. even though my first language was Yiddish. The exclusionary 3 Gs held that I had not been to yeshiva and so didn't know the deep structure of Jewish thought. I was born after the war, meaning after the Churban, and therefore not in the most vibrant secular Yiddish world imaginable. I was not born in Eastern Europe and was therefore far from the long, rich historical tradition of Yiddish in those lands. All that is true of me and almost everyone in this room. But all that also ignored the ability of every man or woman, young or old, born here, there, or anywhere, to learn. I was told I was too old to catch up. I was in my mid-20s. I was told I couldn't type Yiddish, so that was a problem. By then, I could read, write, speak, analyze Yiddish literature, but indeed, I could not type. I was even told my Lodz Yiddish accent was all wrong. Post-war, YIVO led several generations of Yiddish scholars to stop thinking of themselves as the last of anything, to stop thinking that you had to have been born in a particular place at a particular time, speaking Yiddish as your first language in a particular accent in order to become a Yiddish scholar. It's not that there was no more gatekeeping. Anyone who came to YIVO through much of the last century had to pass a certain set of unwritten tests. Were you serious enough? Why were you here? Did you have the right credentials? How was your Yiddish? Where did it come from? But that necessarily changed as demographics changed. In New York, as it had in Vilna, YIVO attracted graduate students from all over the world, from departments of linguistics, history, folklore, English literature, comparative literature, German, Slavic studies, sociology, political science, and more, using the methodologies students had learned in each of these fields. There was no such thing as Holocaust studies yet, but YIVO was the first place in the US where one could study the Holocaust and, just as crucially, where one could study where Ashkenazic Jews came from and what they had created. At a time when there were no Yiddish programs, let alone Yiddish departments in most of the world, Yiddish trained people to research and teach in the various disciplines from which they had come. Okay, so first you have to get it in the right order. Then, oh, I can't have lost 2 pages. Okay, so I don't have a PowerPoint, but I have lost my thread. I am embarrassed. Okay. It's in my, okay. With the establishment, picking right up there, with the establishment of the Max Weinreich Center for Advanced Jewish Studies in '68, it was impossible, or at least highly irresponsible, to be a Yiddish scholar without spending years in the YIVO library and archives, and in YIVO's Yiddish classes in language, history, and culture. YIVO's success in training scholars may have ironically made its role in training scholars less urgent. You can now study Yiddish at the graduate level in a handful of universities throughout North America, Israel, and Europe. You still, of course, need to come to YIVO's unparalleled archive and library. When the Max Weinreich Center invited scholars from all over the world to teach at YIVO, there was no more exciting place to be. The classes I took here were the reason I became a Yiddish professor. But academics was only one part, and arguably not the most significant part of YIVO at its founding. It was, as several of the people who have spoken here have made clear, it was YIVO's self-proclaimed purpose to serve the Jewish people, to be, quote, the palace of the people. There were always, and there continue to be, questions about the relationship between die Hohe Fenster and Jiden von a ganz Jahr. Loosely understood, this is what the French call a division between l'école and la vie, or in the US we call a division between town and gown. YIVO has always had to satisfy both. And YIVO has always been in the business of preservation. The Sammlers, like the folklorists, historians, cultural critics of YIVO, were primarily not university faculty, at least not until the latter third of the 20th century. They were activists, tuels, public intellectuals. We can count on one hand the number of people who had academic positions in the first decades of YIVO in the US, beginning with Max Weinreich at City College in 47, Uriel Weinreich and Schickel Fishman in the 50s. A few more arrived at university positions in the 60s, others in the 70s and 80s, and the numbers grow steadily. It remains to be seen if they will continue to do so. Yiddish studies tended to follow a particular disciplinary trajectory. At YIVO and in universities, research was first in philology, linguistics, social sciences, then history, and a bit later, literature, music, art. YIVO and our home departments gave us the tools to do two things at once: compare the development of Yiddish literature to other literatures, explore the dynamic between Yiddish and American culture, put Yiddish languages in literal conversation with other languages and cultures, situate Jewish and Yiddish history and politics within the broader contexts in which they had been developed. Once, however, Yiddish became established in the universities, making it legitimate by making it commensurate became less urgent. In some ways, we've struggled with the tension that can be traced to Yud Lamed Peretz's first published semi-autobiographical work, Monish. In 1888, Peretz wrote, "Mein Lied wollt anders gar geklingen, ich soll vergoyim goyish singen." My song or my poem would sound different if I were to sing in a non-Jewish language for non-Jews. How different is a question that hasn't quite left us. Among other things, Peretz meant that Yiddish lacked a sufficient vocabulary for love or other aspects of the modern age. In the same year, Shalom Aleichem made a similar claim. A century later, Isaac Bashevis Singer said Yiddish had no words for weaponry or the military. And all of these things were said in Yiddish. There was, in fact, no lack of such words then or now. 20 years later, those Peretz lines, "Anders wollt mein Lied geklingen, ich soll vergoyim goyish singen," those lines disappeared from the text of Monish. Yiddish hadn't altered its lexicon, but the world had changed. There had been mass emigration, the first Russian Revolution, the Kishinev pogrom, the Dreyfus Affair, the first Zionist Congress, the founding of the Bund, the Chernowitz Conference, in which Peretz and others insisted that Yiddish be recognized as a national language of the Jewish people. The distinctiveness or the limitations of Yiddish was no longer at the forefront of cultural inquiry. Nowadays, we're still hovering between Peretz's 1880 declaration and the insistence that Yiddish can express anything. Like our universities, Jewish studies and Yiddish studies has been mired in the political and cultural debates of recent decades, and even more so of recent years. This too is not new to YIVO, which always sought to avoid political rifts, but could rarely do so. YIVO and every university must now ask what diversity means in our context. At least we used to have to ask that until a couple of months ago. One thing it means for us is that Yiddish is no longer solely the provenance of Jews. The further we move from Yiddish as the language spoken and read by the vast majority of world Jewry, the further we have moved from Yiddish studies as being solely in the service of the Jewish people. To many in the academy, the idea that Jewish studies should be in the service of Jews has been considered too parochial. That may be the most radical shift in Yiddish and in Jewish studies in America. I've heard, rather way too often, a sentiment that says, and I quote, "Yiddish speakers are made in the bedroom, not in the classroom." I did not make that up, and it's the first time I've repeated it. That is, Yiddish is inherited at home. It should be clear these days that this is neither true, nor would it give us much hope for the future of Yiddish studies. As a corollary to the political and social debates we've been witnessing, Yiddish studies has become, to some extent, a study of alternatives. Many of us in this room are often asked what draws students to Yiddish. I know that there are students here who are drawn for many different reasons. 30 or 40 years ago, even 20 years ago, we used to be able to say many of our students had a personal connection to Yiddish through family members. This was both an advantage for some and often a challenge for teachers. There was some unspoken assumption that the teacher's job wasn't just to teach grammar and vocabulary and syntax and context, that is to teach the language. It was, for some, the job of our teachers to evoke some latent knowledge of Yiddish, to tap into something like the collective unconscious. I wrote this before I heard Nomi. To tap into the collective unconscious, to unleash students' inner Yiddish. All this while teaching from college Yiddish, a textbook Uriel Weinreich published when, as Leib said earlier, when he was only 23 years old, a few years older than our students. Students who used to come to Yiddish because of family connections rarely stayed longer than the first year, more rarely through the second. Still, my experience teaching at YIVO at the University of Michigan and in many other places more recently suggests that nostalgia is far from dead and should not be disparaged in the way academics sometimes do. There were, to be sure, students who came because they needed Yiddish for academic work, for comparative linguistics or comparative lit, for immigration or labor history, for Eastern European history, for folklore, for Holocaust studies, and so on. These students knew that they needed more than a rudimentary familiarity with the language. YIVO played a crucial role in educating those students through the Uriel Weinreich Sommer program that began, like the Max Weinreich Center, in '68 and '69. The summer program was the only game in town, in any town, for many years. It was the only place to send students for language training. It has been joined by intensive summer programs in various parts of the world, and more students are drawn to these programs because they are not only training for academic jobs, but because they're interested in culture, in theater, music, translation, even something called Yiddish dance. There are certainly students who come in the hopes of continuing to create in Yiddish, not about Yiddish, but in Yiddish. They're certainly looking to reconnect with the past, not necessarily their past, but a particular past many see now in political terms. In our terribly divisive and fraught historical moment, some come because they see Yiddish as having roots in socialism, as an alternative to religion, an alternative to Zionism. Some are drawn to what has come to be called queer Yiddish, by which we are to understand Yiddish as a minority language, non-hegemonic, discriminated against, fighting to be recognized and accepted. At its origins, of course, Yiddish and YIVO were inseparable, as were Yidden and Yiddish. Yiddish as an adjective means both the language and the people. Now YIVO's main language is English, and Yiddish is often just a tool needed for further studies. Yiddish has also become a symbol. Symbols stand for or suggest something else, often an idea. We used to offer varied interpretations of Yiddish culture in Yiddish. Increasingly, we find varied and often competing understandings of Yiddish as a counterculture, a bridge to the past, a symbol of defiance, or as not something, again, not religion, not Zionism, not hegemonic. Perhaps it's inevitable that the richness of the language and its culture is replaced by the richness of its symbolism, but I hope not. The populations who continue to use or study Yiddish have unfortunately had little to say to one another. Those for whom Yiddish is still a heritage language are often surprised by the motivations and interests of younger people who come to Yiddish. The Hasidic and Haredi communities will, for the most part, not read the modern secular literature most of us teach, or will do so only surreptitiously. And scholars are only beginning to deal with these communities' linguistic and literary uses of the language. There's a familiar expression that says, English redt man, Yiddish redt sich. English is spoken, Yiddish speaks. Nowadays, though, Yiddish is more often spoken about than spoken. As US universities begin to cut back on Yiddish language courses, as well as other so-called less commonly taught languages, YIVO's role in language instruction becomes even more important. Literacy, I think, is the most urgent need these days. I mean training in reading Yiddish, but also training in reading its culture and history with a deeper contextualized understanding. Literacy as understanding both the pshat, the straightforward literal meaning of the words, and the sod, the secrets revealed by the words, the worlds they open up for us, the new views to which they may lead us. There is a clear connection that works in both Yiddish and English between Wort und Welt, between the word and the world. We've seen a remarkable increase in the numbers of translations from Yiddish into English and other languages. This is not a commercial interruption. Translation used to have a rather lowly status in the academy. You certainly couldn't get tenure on the basis of translation alone. That has changed dramatically. Translation has sometimes been seen as acquiescence or even betrayal, suggesting that Yiddish won't be read in the original anymore. But experience shows exactly the opposite. Reading works in translation brings people closer to Yiddish, makes them curious about the Yiddish versions, makes some recognize the need for access to the originals. And as translation theorists and critics have often told us, translation gives new life to old texts, revitalizes them as it adds new audiences. For those of us in literary studies, it has been a challenge to write for a primarily English readership about texts that have never been translated. But that too has changed dramatically with new translations. One of the many ironies of Yiddish is that as its popular vernacular use has declined, its status has risen. As early as 1943, Bashevis Singer commented that what had once been the language of der Yiddische Gas was being relegated to the past, while Hebrew, once the language of scholarship and learning, was taking its place on new Jewish streets. There has been resistance to this reversal. The Association of Jewish Studies has reported more faculty claiming Yiddish than Hebrew as their first or second major area of scholarship. Right, that's what I said. And there is a noteworthy statistic reported by Joshua Schickel-Fishman, my favorite statistic. Using US Census Bureau reports, he documented what appeared to be an extraordinary increase in the number of Yiddish speakers. Between 1940 and 1960, an entirely expected 45% decrease in native Yiddish speakers was reported on the Census Bureau, by the Census Bureau. But between 1960 and 1970, there was a 66% increase in those claiming Yiddish as their mother tongue. This number had declined by 1980, but there was still a net increase of 42% over the 1960 figures. Experience and common sense tell us that the numbers need to be reinterpreted to reflect historical realities. Birth rates and immigration do not suggest anything near this rise. The numbers actually parallel those for other language and ethnic groups in America during the same period, Spanish, Italian, Korean, and more, and can only be understood within the context of rising ethnic consciousness during the 60s and responses to the wars in Israel. The most significant change affecting Yiddish studies, as all other studies, is the digital age. It is now possible to research, read, teach texts that were entirely inaccessible when many of us started teaching at universities. OCR recognition and digitization projects at the New York Public Library, the Yiddish Book Center, the Library of Israel, the National Library of Israel and Tel Aviv University, YIVO's various digital projects, including its Guide to the Archives, its Archive on Jewish Life in Poland, the online YIVO Encyclopedia of Jews in Eastern Europe, and more, all of these have changed the field more dramatically than any of us could have imagined. I began these remarks with a partisan song by Shmerka Kasherdzinsky, so let me end with another song by him, written in 1943. Most of you know the resonant Jugendhymn. One stanza ends with, Ewig werden wir verbinden unsere Nächten mit den Heint. We will always connect our past to our present. What's changed is our understanding of unser, of our. But it's still an excellent motto for YIVO going forward. Ewig werden wir gedenken Ewig werden wir verbinden unsere Nächten mit den Heint. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anita. That was just wonderful. Our next speaker is Stefanie Halpern, who is here at the YIVO. She, as was mentioned, I think, briefly before, is responsible for this wonderful new volume of 100 objects, having done the editorial work there, and you'll see she's also done work on exhibitions. She's going to focus on YIVO's post-war archival initiatives collecting America.
Thank you, Deborah. In May 1948, Max Weinreich and Harry L. Laurie, former executive director of the Bureau of Jewish Social Research and director of the Council of Jewish Federations and Welfare Funds at the time, were both invited by the editors of Commentary magazine to participate in an informal conference on writing the history of American Jews. From this was born a symposium on Jewish social research in America, culminating in the responses of 59 scholars and communal workers to comments by Laurie and Weinreich. In making a case for the necessity of, quote, placing Jewish social research on a firm basis, Weinreich, in his remarks, called for a, quote, central planning, research, and training institution in the domain of Jewish social science. He offered that YIVO, with its archive, library, and network of worldwide research workers and collectors, would be the natural place for this central institution. It would seem no coincidence, then, that in September 1950, YIVO publicly announced a program intended to lead to the establishment of a central archive on the Jews of America, focusing on the beginning of mass immigration until 1950. In its project announcement in the YIVO newsletter, the institution lamented that though 2 million Eastern European Jews had arrived in America over the past 80 years, their contributions to both American and Jewish life and culture had garnered little interest among Jewish historians who focused instead on American Jews of German and Sephardic ancestry. This collecting initiative was extremely forward-thinking. Made during a time when archives were mainly viewed as neutral storehouses of the historic record and archivists as non-biased actors at the disposal of scholars, YIVO seemed acutely aware of the control archives could exert over the past. Though the inherent power of archives is widely accepted today, the power to create history or erase it based merely on what is collected and made accessible, YIVO understood decades before this thinking became prevalent that preservation of records is a decisive act that shapes what stories we think matter. Through YIVO's call for materials, the institution acknowledged that though the economic and cultural achievements of America's Eastern European immigrants rivaled those of their German and Sephardic predecessors, the historic record was limited to the stories of those two groups. And because of the lack of interest in writing about the Eastern European Jewish contingent, there was little effort made to preserve the, quote, monuments of that life, a neglect leading to a dearth of material on this population. YIVO wished not only to preserve materials of the Eastern European Jewish past in America, but also to collect contemporaneous materials so to, as, quote, obviate a repetition of our present predicament 50 years hence. It was YIVO's intention to wage a systematic and broad campaign to collect materials that would reflect all eras and facets of Yiddish life in America. And as YIVO did in the pre-war years, they engaged the community in taking an interest in their own past and culture by collecting materials themselves. The call to action in the newsletter stated, YIVO summons all friends and organizations to rise and take an active part in gathering materials and documents, and thereby become participants in the establishment of a great and important institution for the future of American Jewry. YIVO made appeals to individuals to participate by sending in any of the old published and handwritten materials they possessed. YIVO asked for things like letters in all languages, journals, booklets from membership associations, bulletins, newsletters, school materials, anything connected to communal and cultural organizations, and more. YIVO also made requests to Jewish organizations who had played a central role in the construction of the Jewish immigrant community in America. YIVO asked that these organizations think about what might be useful to scholars and to hand over any institutional records that were no longer necessary to maintain their current activities, including things like minute books, cash books, written and printed correspondence, membership lists, and on and on. YIVO explained that it was imperative to have their records preserved so that generations to come would be able to use these materials to produce research about each institution's role in the shaping of American Jewish life. YIVO promised that any donated materials would be listed in the YIVO newsletter. They often made good on their promise, though many more materials were donated than YIVO had the capacity to highlight. A quick perusal through the newsletters of the 1950s reveals the donation of some of the following large institutional archives. In 1951, YIVO received the collection of the United Service for New Americans. The records of the National Desertion Bureau arrived in 1953. The Educational Alliance and the records of the early activities of HIAS, including the work of the Ellis Island Bureau, came in 1954, and the National Conference of Jewish Communal Service in 1956. Smaller collections included such treasures as materials on the efforts of the United Non-Sectarian Boycott Committee of the Bronx towards the American boycott of Nazi goods in the 1930s, Yiddish publications from Kansas City, Kansas, and Sioux City, Iowa, documents from the B'nai Zion Society of St. Louis by way of a rabbi in Natchez, Mississippi, activities of congregations throughout the country, including bulletins, announcements, pamphlets, and reports sent from congregations in Hollywood, California, Rochester, New York, Denver, Colorado, Chicago, Illinois, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Richmond, Virginia, and New Brunswick, New Jersey. Complete sets of the Jewish Tribune from Portland, Oregon, records of the Jewish Anarchist Agricultural Colony in Clarion, Utah, materials on the Cooperative Colony Jersey homesteads, materials on Jewish organizations in Detroit and Los Angeles, materials on the Sholem Aleichem houses, and the collection of Beit HaMidrash Hagadol founded by Eastern European immigrants in 1852. In advertising these donations, YIVO was explicit in the types of scholarship they could support. Things like the history of Jewish immigration to the US, studies in the socioeconomic adjustment of recent Jewish arrivals and general acculturation, the demographic and occupational structure of Eastern European Jewish immigrants, the impact of their new home upon them, and more. The decision to publicly announce an effort to create a central repository of materials on Jewish life in America represents a conscious choice to acknowledge an official expansion of activities and a widening of the scope of YIVO's collecting and research interests. And here I'd just like to be very clear that I'm not suggesting that YIVO shifted its focus away from the culture of Jews in Eastern Europe, as we've heard today. To be sure, YIVO still sought out these materials and continued to produce scholarship on them, albeit in a modified way, now that the collecting was being done in a drastically changed Jewish landscape. Rather, I'm saying that YIVO's collecting opened up to also include these American materials now in a very systematic way. The announcement can also be viewed as a recognition of YIVO's position as an American institution interested not only in participating in the documentation of American Jewry, but in the shaping of it as well. In 1959, YIVO proclaimed that it was the first and the only institution in existence in America that was concerned with the history of Eastern European Jews in the US, and with the institutions, cultural bodies, unions, and mutual aid and relief organizations they had set up. What would the American Jewish community be, YIVO wrote in the newsletter that year, if it did not have a research center to gather the records of our national experiences and to draw the scientifically controlled inferences of these experiences for our community? Some might object to this notion, that YIVO was the only institution in the country at the time collecting materials on Eastern European Jews in America, and cite, for instance, the American Jewish Historical Society as a counter to this claim. But their own mission, with its conspicuous lack of mention of Jews of Eastern Europe, doesn't support this. And I'll just read the mission. The object of this society is to collect and publish material bearing upon the history of our country. It is known that Jews in Spain and Portugal participated in some degree in the voyages which led to the discovery of America, and that there were Jews from Holland, Great Britain, Jamaica, and other countries among the earliest settlers of several of the colonies. There were also a number of Jews in the Continental Army, and others contributed liberally to defray the expenses of the Revolutionary War. Since the foundation of our government, a number of Jews have held important public positions. the genealogy of these men, and the records of these achievements will, when gathered together, be of value and interest to the historian, and perchance contribute materially to the history of our country. Though 1950 could be considered the start of the official expansion of YIVO's scope, this grand ambition was precipitated by a number of activities focusing on Jewish life in America that took place throughout the 1940s, alongside, of course, other initiatives such as the restitution of YIVO's pre-war collections and the active collecting of materials documenting Jewish life under Nazi rule. For example, in 1942, YIVO mounted the essay contest Why I Left Europe and What I Accomplished in America, open for all Jewish men and women not born in the US or Canada who had emigrated from Europe between 1900 and the 1930s. A supplementary contest to this was announced in 1952, What Changes Have the Last 10 Years Affected in My Life and Views, the purpose of which was to determine how the events of the recent past had affected Jewish immigrants living in America. In 1945 to 1946, YIVO held an essay contest for Jewish soldiers and veterans on the subject of my experiences and observations as a Jew in World War II. YIVO also circulated questionnaires, gathering information about pressing issues for American Jewry. In 1944, for example, we heard all about this questionnaire this morning in response to the 1943 instruction issued by the Commissioner General of Immigration that Jews could no longer be classified as a race, but only as a religious community. YIVO circulated a questionnaire regarding the classification of Jewish immigrants in America. In 1949, the Yud Lamakahan Folklore Club conducted the first of what was meant to be a series of studies on Jewish holidays in various lands and sent out a questionnaire on Passover customs in the Old Country and in America. YIVO's scholarly activities and publications in the 1940s and 1950s also reflected this broadening interest. For example, Jewish life in America was a central theme of the 24th annual conference. In that same year, YIVO embarked on several other initiatives, including the transformation of the shtetl Jew, a study meant to highlight the social changes in the lives of Jews that had come to America from shtetls, focusing on the past 3 generations of immigrants. YIVO also announced the first of what would become a years-long essay contest for the best essay by a graduate or undergraduate, focusing on an aspect of American Jewish life. In this contest, YIVO was interested in scholarship that represented, quote, the inner life of this community, the process through which it passes, and the problems it presents. At YIVO's 26th annual conference, a resolution was adopted for YIVO to engage in the planning and publication of a history of the Jews in America on the occasion of the tercentenary of Jewish life in this country. And the 28th annual conference in 1954 was dedicated to American Jewish life in honor of this anniversary. In 1956, YIVO even formed a social science circle whose goal was to, quote, become a forum and center for Jewish social science research on American Jews, stimulating work in a field that has too long been neglected. YIVO also placed a greater emphasis on publishing studies of American Jewish life in publications such as the YIVO Annual. Kopel Pinson, in the editor's preface to Volume 5 of the YIVO Annual, published in 1950, acknowledges the reasons for this. The inclusion in this volume of materials on the United States, Canada, and Israel demonstrates once again the living contact of YIVO not only with East European Jewry, but also with all of the newer and vital centers of Jewish activity. YIVO also embarked on the publication of the first 2 volumes of Elias Cherikover's series on the Jewish labor movement in the United States in 1943 and 1945, respectively. Cherikover, who began these volumes before the war, died before what was intended to be a 5-volume work could be completed. But in an attempt to continue his efforts, YIVO solicited collection donations to support their research. Though the series was ultimately never completed, materials were received from dozens of individuals and organizations involved in the American labor movement, including William Wolpert, Executive Secretary of the United Hebrew Trades, Charles S. Zimmerman, Vice President of the ILGWU, Jacob C. Rich of the Forward staff, as well as cultural figures such as Yiddish American sweatshop poet Morris Rosenfeld and Yiddish anarchist poet David Edelstadt. YIVO's interest in Eastern European Jewish life in America did not wane in the decades following the establishment of the Central Archive. Major collections were received in the 1960s and 1970s from organizations such as the Workmen's Circle, the American Ozeh Committee, the Jewish Education Service of North America, and the Joint Distribution Committee. In the late 1970s, YIVO waged an active campaign to collect the records of remaining Landsmannschaften throughout New York City. In some ways, this project was a realization of what YIVO believed in the 1950s was a key component of their work. At that time, YIVO was attracted to the immense resources of materials that could be available by appealing to Landsmannschaften. But YIVO understood as well that many involved were reluctant to give up their materials because of an emotional attachment to these objects, viewing them as symbolic connections not only to the old world, but also to their families and to their own youth. Though YIVO was able to collect some materials from members of various Landsmannschaften, it was not until the initiation of the Landsmannschaften project in 1978 that this initiative was fully realized. During the course of the project, YIVO's aim was to identify and locate the estimated 2,000 remaining Landsmannschaften in the US, with the goal of promoting the idea of depositing their records at YIVO so that they would be preserved and made available to researchers. During the first months of this project, YIVO staff worked to create relationships with the officers of these organizations and conducted a campaign to heighten awareness among members of Landsmannschaften regarding the great historical value of their records. Your participation in YIVO's Landsmannschaften project is an important contribution to documenting an exciting chapter in American Jewish history, YIVO wrote. The documents collected in this historic undertaking will perpetuate the history of your society and the work it accomplished for Landslight the world over. YIVO mailed out thousands of record surveys soliciting information about the establishment and history of the organization, its previous and current functions, its relief efforts during both world wars, information about the makeup of its membership, leadership, and dues structure, and even asked about the types of disagreements that might come up amongst members of the Landsmannschaft. The answers to the questionnaires provided a treasure trove of information. The need to collect these materials was even greater in 1978 than it was in the 1950s. In its application to the National Archives and Records Administration, which provided funding for the project in the amount of $87,000 through a National Historical Publications and Records Commission grant, YIVO explained that these mutual aid societies were disappearing at a rate of 15% per year. Now, nearly 30 years after their initial efforts, rather than having to overcome an intense clinging to the past, YIVO was operating from a position where materials were at risk of being discarded or destroyed. Already, there was so much that had potentially been lost. A response on one questionnaire from a member of the Friends of Alexandrov wrote, "Our only reason for dissolving after 57 years is that everyone is old. There are only 3 members younger than I, and I'm almost 74 years. Most members moved away, and the others are afraid to travel by subway. I expect to move to Florida in the next few months also. I am sorry I didn't hear from you sooner, because I had copies of letters I sent out for maybe 20 years, but getting ready to move, I threw them away." By the end of the project, YIVO had amassed the largest and most significant collection of documentation on this unique immigrant institution, with over 800 Landsmannschaften represented. In addition to a published guide to these collections, YIVO mounted an exhibition in 1986, Hello Landsman, featuring materials from the collection. Frank G. Burke, acting archivist of the United States at the time, participated in a program in conjunction with the exhibition in which he commented on YIVO's role in the important work of documenting American immigrant history. YIVO continues to receive materials from every Landsmannschaft that closes down, and today there are over 1,500 represented. I'll also mention briefly, as an example of YIVO's continued role in the documentation and research of Eastern European Jewish life in America, the Milstein Family Communal Archive Project, which was a 3-year initiative launched in 2006, intended to develop a preservation and research program based on the archival heritage of various New York Jewish social service organizations. Reflecting the period of early migration, the archives of these institutions, YIVO believed, would be not only an invaluable resource for the study for studying the trajectory of immigrant Jewish life in America, but would also allow generations of scholars to write the histories of these institutions and the unique role they played in shaping Jewish life. The historic archives of Jewish communal agencies, stated YIVO in its project plan, are as integral and as important to the larger Jewish community as the old records of births, marriages, and deaths maintained by pre-war communities in Europe. YIVO's initiative, which recognized that there were various financial and administrative challenges facing these institutions, proved prescient. Nyana closed in 2008, and FEGS faced Chapter 11 in 2015, eventually shuttering its operations. Both of these collections became part of YIVO's archives, and they were added to the estimated 10,000 linear feet of material YIVO possessed at the time on Jewish life in America. I'll end here at the beginning by going back to 1950. Max Weinreich wrote in the foreword to Volume 5 of the YIVO Annual, "In the European period of its quarter-century existence, YIVO was chiefly engaged in the study of the sociology, history, psychology, language, and literature of Eastern European Jewry. But we firmly believe that YIVO also has a singular contribution to make to the study of the changes in Jewish culture and personality in a changing America." YIVO's approach to scholarship, according to Weinreich, did not advocate merely for the study of the history and culture of Jews in Eastern Europe, or only for the study of American Jewish history as it related to American history. Rather, YIVO's approach was a comparative one that allowed for a broadening of the narrative where the Eastern European Jewish past becomes an integral part of understanding the American present. Through this, YIVO's contribution to both scholarship and to the preservation of materials was the elevation of this American present to the position of an important aspect of Jewish history as well.
Thank you, Stefanie, very much. Our third speaker is Rebecca Margolis. She comes all the way from Australia for this talk, which is great, where she is has a chair in Jewish civilization at Monash University. And I draw your attention to several of the books that she has written that's listed under her biography. She will be speaking about learning Yiddish with YIVO, a century of cultural transmission.
Shalom Aleichem, teire Freund. I'd like to begin by thanking my colleagues at YIVO and my fellow presenters at this conference for the opportunity to collaboratively reflect on the immense impact the organization has had on research and education in Yiddish. Given the scope of my topic and the time limitations, I will briefly highlight a few salient points concerning YIVO's roots and its post-1940 educational work in America. I will then focus on the model of immersive language pedagogy developed by the summer program, from now on the Zoomer program, assessing its long-term influence on Yiddish teaching, scholarship, cultural activity, and community building. My sources include findings from a survey of program alumni that I conducted this past year, where I received 160 responses from students who attended between 1971 and 2024. Let me briefly introduce the pre-1940 period. Since its founding in 1925, YIVO has placed education alongside research on Eastern European Jewish language and culture at the heart of its mission, with the aim of forming a people-oriented institutional foundation for Yiddish scholarship. Nochem Stiff, co-founder of the then-named Yiddish Scientific Institute, proposed in 1924 a model to coordinate research, collect materials, standardize the language, and train scholars to raise the prestige of the language and its culture. Despite the symbiosis between scholarship and pedagogy, education and advanced training in YIVO's pedagogical section, reactivated in 1927 as the pedagogical psychological section, was slower to gain traction in its early years. The section's work included outreach work to young people as ethnographic collectors, planning a pedagogy museum, documenting Jewish schools in Eastern Europe and America, and, in the 1930s, training teachers and hosting a graduate seminar through its Aspirantur model. The audience for this work was a stateless, Yiddish-speaking population facing socioeconomic challenges and uncertainty. Under Max Weinreich's leadership, the wartime relocation of YIVO's headquarters to New York in 1940 reoriented its educational initiatives towards an American Jewish population. As Cecile Kuznets observes, in the wake of the Holocaust, YIVO's mission was irrevocably altered as it came to terms with the decimation of the Yiddish-speaking folk that had constituted its raison d'etre. With no expectation that an Americanizing population would return to Yiddish, Max Weinreich turned his attention to cultivating a scholarly succession among a select group during a period that included the 1955 renaming of YIVO as the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, and deep uncertainty about the organization's future objectives. In 1968, he became the posthumous namesake of the Max Weinreich Center for Advanced Jewish Studies, established as an American successor to the Aspirantur program to offer seminars and training for graduate students. Alongside this vision emerged a future-focused narrative surrounding Yiddish in America, embodied by Uriel Weinreich, Max's son, who had relocated to New York with his father as a Yiddish-speaking teenager. With the benefit of hindsight, this narrative forms the central focus of my discussion today. Without delving into too much detail, Uriel Weinreich introduced the following forward-looking innovations to support Yiddish in America during a life tragically cut short by illness in 1967 at the age of 40. Number one, Uriel Weinreich authored College Yiddish, published in 1949 by the YIVO when he was just 23. With so much that could be said about College Yiddish, I'll point out here that the volume underpinned formal education in Yiddish for decades and remains in print today. I'd also like to briefly draw your attention to Weinreich's introduction to his volume in 1949 and his comments in 1960. So you can see here, in 1949, his sense of connection with the YIVO, that's very clearly articulated. And then in 1960, his surprise at the way that this volume really altered the trajectory of Yiddish language education in America. Number two, Weinreich was appointed the Atran Chair for Yiddish Language, History, and Culture at Columbia University in 1951, where he institutionalized Yiddish as an academic field and mentored scholars and teachers, including Mordechai Schechter, Joshua A. or Schickel Fishman, and Marvin Herzog. He also mentored the next generation of leaders of the 1960s Jugendruf youth movement. Number three, Weinreich led research in the emerging field of socioeconomics, producing foundational studies such as his 1953 book, Languages in Contact. Number four, Weinreich collected the lexicographical data that formed the basis for the modern English-Yiddish-English dictionary, published posthumously in 1968. Number five, he lent his name and posthumous vision to the Uriel Weinreich Summer Program in Yiddish Language, Literature, and Culture, established in 1968 in collaboration with Columbia University, co-sponsored by NYU in 2005 and currently by Bard College. Cecile Kuznets observes of the YIVO Zuma program and the Max Weinreich Center. The alumni of both programs soon became leaders in the expanding field of Jewish studies across the United States, fulfilling their namesake's vision of YIVO in fruitful dialogue with the American academic scene. As a young Yiddish-speaking academic transplant to the United States, Uriel Weinreich envisioned the next steps for promoting Yiddish continuity among his cohort of Americanizing migrants and their descendants, steps actualized by the YIVO program. The major reorientation entailed not only the language shift in the United States, as documented by Schickel Fishman in the 1960s, but also a broader question of where to situate Yiddish in the evolving American Jewish experience, beyond Yinglish and Leo Rostin's The Joys of Yiddish, the coding of Jewishness in sitcoms, or the nostalgia of Fiddler on the Roof that was so sharply critiqued by public intellectual Irving Howe. My focus today is that immersive Yiddish summer program and its impact on Yiddish teaching and broader cultural transmission. The YIVO Zuma program became the flagship model of intensive Yiddish learning, with similar programs emerging in recent decades across the United States, Canada, Israel, Germany, France, England, and Poland. With my remaining time, I will focus on key points of impact in the 1970s, the 1990s, and the 2020s. So in the first period, the 1970s to the 1980s. In its first decade after 1968, the Zuma program had not yet emerged as YIVO's flagship educational offering. The 50th anniversary volume of YIVO Blätter briefly references the Zuma program in its section on Der Limud von Sprach und Sprachwissenschaft, Language and Learning Scholarship. Authored by Moltke Schechter in 1977, the article presents Yiddish study as integral to YIVO's work to encompass general education and specific groups with the Aspirantur program as its highest level. Schechter briefly outlines YIVO's, quote, comprehensive program of Yiddish language learning in its new intensive format, administered by Marvin Herzog and with Schechter as its main teacher, noting that its 4 levels are, quote, in general, very successful. Schechter's report goes on to detail a wide range of earlier and contemporaneous educational programs, including courses and seminars offered by YIVO and its affiliates worldwide, lectures, pedagogical materials, including Van Raag's College Yiddish and Schechter's Yiddish 2 textbook and its orthographic guide, as well as translations into Yiddish, some of which were, quote, nicht gewen beschert, Hitler yamach shemoy. So didn't come into fruition, Yamach shemoy. The same volume includes photos of the 1977 Aspirantur and Zuma program classes. So this is where you all get to mumble and point out everyone who's in all of these photos. There are going to be a couple of these, so it's a fun activity. Schechter's cursory report suggests the transitional state of Yiddish education at YIVO's 50th anniversary. Schechter's listings include projects dating back to the 1930s, but no overarching pedagogical objective for the YIVO. Stepping beyond Schechter's subdued assessment, recent qualitative data from program graduates from the 1970s underscores the deep significance of the Zuma program. This is reflected in both social media as a site of collective recollection and in my survey of Zuma program alumni, which reveals patterns regarding the program's role as a sustained educational space for Yiddish language and culture. A key theme in the 1970s and 80s is that the YIVO Zuma program was the first and, at its time, only immersive Yiddish program of its kind, joined only later by the Oxford Summer Yiddish program in the early 1980s. As such, it played a formative role in fostering new community around Yiddish. The Zuma program served a generation that came of age during a countercultural era marked by a broader return to roots, exemplified by the klezmer revival and the culture that emerged around the fusion of traditional Ashkenazi instrumental music with Yiddish language lyrics. The year 1980 also marked the founding of the Yiddish Book Center. This section draws on my 2025 online survey of Yiddish Zuma program graduates and a December 2023 Facebook post by Naomi Seidman in which she shared a photo of the 1991 graduating class. The post generated dozens of comments over a period of several months, identifying individuals in the image and reminiscing about participants' experiences in the program. The list reads like a condensed who's who of the Jewish studies academic world, including Jack Kugelmass, Michael Stanislavski, Diane Roskis, Robert Moses Shapiro, Janet Hatta, and David Neil Miller. Baker also shared a page from his class notes, you can see on the right there. In his survey response, Baker noted, academically and socially, the summer program was everything that my undergraduate institution was not, and in a good way. He also recalled poet Yankov Glatstein as a guest lecturer in the enrichment portion of the Zuma program shortly before Glatstein's death in November of 1971. He added that several of his classmates remain among his closest friends. Robert Moses Shapiro's survey response corroborates Baker's observations by listing his remarkable cohort. This enthusiasm is further reflected in the quantitative survey results from this cohort. While the results are speculative, several trends emerge, notably the overrepresentation of this cohort in describing the program as paradise. So you can see we're dealing here with the light blue and dark blue group. And the degree to which alumni have remained in contact even 53 years later. So you can see, again, If we include 1970 to 1984, this is a group that's really stayed together over time. I'm now going to move into the 1990s period. The 1990s represent a distinct stage in the development of the Zuma program and Yiddish in America more broadly. Klezmer music entered the world music scene, classic Yiddish films were remastered and re-released with subtitles for broad audiences, and the field of American Yiddish studies, encompassing linguistic, historical, ethnographic, literary, and cultural approaches, expanded from a bookshelf to a bookcase. This area coincided with both a new media discourse around Yiddish revival and Joshua A. Fishman's scholarship on reversing language shift. The 1990s formed the backdrop for Jeffrey Chandler's widely cited Adventures in Yiddish Land, Post-Vernacular Language and Culture, which argues that in a post-Holocaust reorientation of Yiddish, the language functions as a symbolic resource that extends its communicative role. Within this post-vernacular mode, the YIVO Zuma program cultivated an immersive Yiddish environment through daily classroom instruction combined with a wide range of activities, including lectures, song workshops, and field trips to sites of memory or Hasidic neighborhoods in the New York area. The 1990 Zuma program served a different cohort from that of the 1970s and 80s, though it continued to foster a sense of participation in a distinctive program. By the turn of the millennium, the intensive Yiddish education model had expanded to include Paris at the Medem Bibliothek, Amherst at the Yiddish Book Center, Vilnius, Tel Aviv, and Weimar, among others. Here is the 1991 graduating class image, courtesy of alumni Leah Garrett, which generated the extensive and ongoing discussion on Facebook, as well as a seg to the class of 1996, which current academic director of YIVO, David Braun, calls a banner year. The cover of, and here again you can look and see, play the game, see who you can name. The cover of the 1998 edition of College Yiddish. Oh yes, so here is the game being played on Facebook. So if you want to check out this Facebook post, there are dozens of responses where everybody is naming everybody who participated in the summer program and what happened to them. The cover of the 1998 edition of College Yiddish, released with a new illustrated design, reflects how deeply the Zuma program had become integrated with that textbook and by extension with YIVO's Yiddish educational model. The Zuma program students, as well as its instructors and guest presenters, featured a who's who of scholars and creatives active in Yiddish scholarly and cultural milieus, offering participants a strong sense of belonging within that space. A common denominator of survey responses before 2000 is students citing pragmatic rationales, language learning for university courses specifically, rather than motivations related to identity or community building. I'm now going to move into the 2020s. In brief, the post-coronavirus cohort represents another stage in YIVO's educational offerings. Like many educational initiatives during the lockdowns, the YIVO Zuma program shifted deftly online during the pandemic, and its digital offers expanded exponentially. A 2020 media article titled, "Times are schwach, but Yiddish classes are booming." You've got that, there it is. YIVO summer language course gets a big boost in attendance for its all-digital program, reported a graduating class of 120, marking a 60% increase in enrollment from the previous year. The virtual model dramatically expanded the program's accessibility. Survey respondents from 2020 recalled virtual enrichment activities, including pickle-making workshops. As I discuss in my 2021 study, forays into a digital Yiddish land, secular Yiddish in the early stages of the coronavirus pandemic, the pandemic significantly expanded and diversified Yiddish engagement. I'm now going to conclude. I conclude with a few thoughts on the general trajectory of YIVO's Yiddish teaching over the past century. From the mid-1920s through 1940, YIVO's leaders and audience were Yiddish speakers, and education signified the elevation of a civilization through the gathering of data and scholarship. The destruction and uprooting of that civilization demanded a complete reorientation in the face of the crisis, a process that required decades and remains ongoing today. What is Yiddish today, and for whom, why, and how? In many ways, Uriel Weinreich was attuned to the needs of the American-raised generation of heritage speakers and to the parameters of Yiddish studies as an academic field. However, Weinreich could not have anticipated the extent to which Yiddish would resonate as an identity marker. As Amelia Glazer's 27 study, The Idea of Yiddish, Reglobalizing North American Jewish Culture, posits, as a borderless diaspora language, Yiddish is invoked beyond North American Jewish culture as an emblem of transnational memory, radical politics, and cultural reclamation. Anyone involved with Yiddish over the last 20 years is acutely aware of how much the Yiddish world has expanded in meaning and in the diversity of those who identify with it, and how much a virtual Yiddish land, punctuated by intensive and temporary physical sites, such as immersive language programs and cultural festivals, has evolved alongside it. In my book, Yiddish Lives On, I suggest that the enactment of Yiddish in meaningful, participatory, and embodied ways provides increasingly significant sites of engagement with Yiddish outside the Hasidic world, and I call this creative language spaces. It is no coincidence that the YIVO's YIVO's Zuma program website quotes a student from 2015. For me, YIVO is a place where we can find the real Yiddish. As the world continues to fracture, real, embodied Yiddish in created language spaces represents an invaluable cultural resource. In this brief talk, I have considered the YIVO's contributions to Yiddish language learning as a form of cultural transmission, with a focus on its flagship Zuma program. Of course, there is much more to say. For example, my survey responses reveal significant statistical correlation by year of birth, year attended, and gender, topics beyond the scope of this presentation. I have highlighted how the Zuma program has evolved to offer a robust, resilient, and enduring model for connecting with language and culture, and for training future scholars and cultural carriers in a post-Holocaust world. I look forward to our continued conversation. Ashenim Dank.
Thank you for three really different and interesting and stimulating presentations. We have some time because everyone was really good and stuck to the 20-minute minimum, maximum time slot for some questions. So it's open. I see a hand in the back.
That was me? Me? No.
Could you repeat the question for those online? Could you repeat the question?
I was interested in the correlations between gender and year of birth and year attended the summer program, which you just mentioned.
Does this work? Yeah. I'm sorry I can't do this auf Regel Achis on one foot. If there's a publication that comes out of this, then I will do the analysis. I can say that I have an amazing research assistant named Annabelle Noir who loves this kind of regression analysis. And so the data is there, but there are like hundreds of correlations to be made, yeah.
Thank you. This might be too, theoretical, but where do you, for the whole panel, feel that the graduates of these programs and this, developing Yiddish world is going to go in the next 5 to 10 years?
Where they're going to go?
Well, we always need more archivists and librarians who have both language and content knowledge. So that's one place.
Look, I think they're going to go, I mean, you can answer that. We should have you raise your hands. What are you going to do next? Some will go on, I assume, I understand, to continue graduate work in whatever fields they're in. A few may get academic jobs in Yirtzeh Hashem, although I wouldn't hold my breath. But, some will, and some will become, people who work in the communities where translation or libraries or Jewish or interfaith communication is necessary, which is to say they'll work in the world.
I'm going to give a slightly more maximalist response because just because I have the privilege and honor of teaching in an immersive Yiddish language setting, and I've appreciated the fact that my students are increasingly on a Yiddish journey. So there isn't a goal, there's not an objective or a place they think they're going to land. They're on it for the ride with a fellow cohort building this community, and it doesn't have an end to it. It's potentially a lifetime of community building. And I think it's not something I had the time to go into in depth, but it's one of the things that the survey also bears out, that the ways that Yiddish learners in the 1920s are envisioning their connection with Yiddish seems to be more of a lifetime, almost marrying into a culture or immigrating to a new place, and the sense that it's going to be a very long, enduring connection no matter what.
Gausje?
Hold on, Haas, I want some.
You need the mic.
Thank you. So having served a few times on selecting students for the summer program, I was really struck by, for one thing, the number who were applying from Central and Eastern Europe, okay, and from countries we would assume were once the heartbeds of Yiddish, the heartland of Yiddish life, and obviously this application process and their participation was a reflection of the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Soviet bloc, and also the number of students who in their applications said directly, I'm not Jewish, but I want to do this. And I wonder how you see this new era impacting the summer program, but also generally what YIVO does and Yiddish studies.
I mean, you're asking both a demographic and an ideological question. What I was trying to say was that YIVO's foundation one of its foundational goals to serve the Jewish people isn't over, but it's also, I think, insufficient. That is, it's necessary but insufficient as part of what it does. Because as you say, we've seen this even in Michigan, where you wouldn't think people would show up, from China to study Yiddish, but there is increasing interest from non-Jews coming both from Eastern Europe, from the places where Jews once lived, and places where Jews didn't live in great numbers. There's something that attracts them to Yiddish that is partly community. I take your point very seriously, and is partly, what was there in those cultures? What existed there? Is there anything that we can learn from there for our own times? And I think the answer to all of that is always yes. A lot and yes.
I'd like to jump in. Yeah.
Okay.
So in terms of that's another change that if I'd had more time I would have noted for the 1990s, is the 1990s suddenly Eastern Europe isn't buried over there. So people started coming from Eastern Europe, speaking with the Slavic accents that native Yiddish speakers would also have brought. And there was also this opening up of new archives and new possibilities. So I think that was a huge shift in the 1990s due to that precisely, and a shift in the cohort. And again, I see that in the survey results, a huge increase in people coming from Eastern European locations to study Yiddish, but living in those locations, not immigrating to the US, going back and doing work. In the 2020s, it's interesting that Yiddish is among a number of lesser spoken languages that are generally not native languages to their speakers or their speakers' families. So if you look at, for example, what are the fastest rising languages on Duolingo during the pandemic and since then, we have Yiddish, we have Gaelic, we have Klingon. Those are the three biggest increases. So And it's funny, but there's also an Esperanto, of course. So there's this sort of interest in lesser spoken, quirky, interesting languages, but I think it's also a space for a generation that may not necessarily connect with a backward-looking ethnic identity and be interested in building something new. And so it's a meeting space. So language becomes a place to gather and to build. Of course, there are always the heritage speakers and people looking to reconnect with their past, particularly a lot of students who have one Jewish parent or find out that they're Jewish or find out that they have a Jewish grandparent. And that often is that Eastern European cohort where students come to YIVO because they find out that they're actually Jewish and they didn't know. And this just came to the fore. So that's an interesting thing too. But I think that we are actually very fortunate to be in this really vibrant, exciting space that is it's not dwindling or diminishing at all. And I think if we translate Yiddish, the slogan "Fahren Jiddischen Volk" as for the Yiddish people, then I think we're doing a thing here around Yiddish.
Okay, Jonathan, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to add a little bit to this. When I first went to Vilnius, to the Central State Archives, where they had stored many of the archival documents that were rescued after the war, I was shown Yiddish materials upside down. They couldn't read them, they didn't know what they had, etc. Today, in this Azumer program class is a young woman from Vilnius who is here, who works for the National Library, who wants to improve her Yiddish in order to work in the library on Yiddish materials. When I was in Vilnius this past week, I met with 4 of the faculty at Vilnius University who are in Jewish studies, each of which has taken classes online from YIVO, each of whom is intent on improving their Yiddish. Why? Not for family reasons, not really for even academic reasons, because they could be doing something else in the university, but because their generation is developing the idea, and it's a very important one. It didn't exist 20 or 30 years ago, that Jewish history is part of Lithuanian history, and Lithuanian history is part of Jewish history, and they have to know about that because it's a huge gap for them. And therefore, it's a huge gap in their own national narrative. So there are many reasons there. In America, I would say, the work of translation, as Anita was getting at, I think, in your talk, the needs of translation are enormous. We can't think that we have even gotten to the middle of the beginning. And the needs for what, I can't remember whose presentation Max Weinreich proposed, and I wish somebody would take that idea up. There needs to be dual language editions of Yiddish work with glossaries, with footnotes, with introductions, exactly as there are when you take German or you take Russian or you take French. I don't know why those teaching editions do not exist. Maybe they do. If they do, I haven't seen them.
There are some that are beginning to be produced that are sort of shorter versions of Yiddish literary texts. The real problem, I've had this problem before where I've wanted to have facing pages. I don't understand the problem, you know, but somewhere between publishing from, printing from right to left and left to right makes publishers nuts.
Publishers are always nuts.
This is also true.
That is no excuse.
But
This is easily done if people want to pay attention to
I'm not suggesting
it.
it's an excuse.
I can
I'm just
tell you,
telling
I was
my
45
experience.
years a publisher.
You were in publishing. So the only place that I've ever, Jonathan, I'm with you 1,000%. The only place where I've ever had luck, been able to publish Yiddish, you know, writing, Yiddish Oisius, along with English letters, is the PMLA, right? PMLA has Yiddish writing, and the Yiddish Book Center has also been doing some of that. But yeah, I agree with you 1,000,000%, yes.
Okay, Sam.
Two comments. The outstanding student in the intermediate level Zuma program in 1987 was a young fellow from Belfast named Robert McAllister. I didn't ask him why. He did tell me that he had taken elementary Yiddish at Queen's University in Belfast, and his Yiddish professor had told him that if he wanted to continue in Yiddish, he had to come to the YIVO Zuma program. He also told me that his parents objected to his coming, not because he was going to be studying Yiddish, but because he was going to be around so many Catholics in New York. The other comment, I was reminded by Anita's reference to the Bashevis Singer notice that Hebrew was outgrowing Yiddish, and her reference to Yiddish speakers are made in the bedroom and not in the classroom.
That is not my line.
I
just
know,
want to be
I know.
clear about that.
I only mentioned that you referred to it, and I was reminded of something that Judd Teller wrote in, I think, 1952. He noted that when he was a young fellow, 20 years earlier, it was no kunst for a young Jew to know Yiddish. This was common. But if a young Jew knew Hebrew at that time, that was a sign of learning. And that 20 years hence, that is, by the 1970s, Teller predicted that it will, now that there's a Jewish state where Hebrew is the national language, it will be no kunst in 20 years for a young Jew to know Hebrew. There'll be many of them. But if a young Jew in 20 years hence will know Yiddish, that will be a sign of learning.
Thank you, thank you. Okay.
Yes, well, first of all, Yasher Koyach to all the presenters, really everyone today, throughout the whole day. So my question has to do with something I've thought a lot about, that, of course, since the pandemic, especially with the advent of Zoom and online classes, right, YIVO's classes and Yiddish classes all over have expanded so greatly. And just yesterday in chatting at the reception, I had a conversation with a student saying, Yiddish isn't offered at my university, but I can take a class online at another university, and that's such a wonderful opportunity for me. And then, at the same time, I had a conversation saying, well, it's so great to be here in person for the summer program because there's no substitute for creating that kind of in-person community where you can have informal interactions in Yiddish and make lasting friendships, et cetera, right? And at the same time, like with in Stefanie's presentation speaking about digitization, right, this is a tremendous boon to scholars all over the world that they can access YIVO collections online wherever they are. But on the other hand, scholars today don't have the same experience of walking into the reading room and meeting people from all over the world who came to be in the same room because that was the only place they could get access to the YIVO collections. So I'm just wondering, I guess primarily to Rivka, but really to all of you about your thoughts about this balance between the way Zoom and digitalization and all these new technologies have really enabled a minority culture covering the entire world, right, to have a kind of, a flourishing that wouldn't otherwise be available to people outside of New York and major urban centers. But on the other hand, it also makes it harder to have the kind of in-person interactions that are arguably so important to perpetuating a scholarly community and particularly a minority language like Yiddish?
So I think there's an optimal way for this to work. And I think that way is that there are calendars punctuated by in-person gatherings, and there are so many opportunities for these. And of course, it can be financially complicated, but for students, there are very often scholarships available. So there's basically a year-long calendar of Yiddish festivals and immersive programs and events that happen really around the world. It's actually surprising how geographically dispersed these are. And you go to 1 or 2 of these a year, and then you maintain your connections by taking online Yiddish classes and whatever other virtual digital activities. But I do agree, I do think those face-to-face meetings are absolutely essential. But the digital landscape has really evened out the inequalities around access to Yiddish that previously were a problem. So issues with mobility, financial issues, people in very remote geographic regions not necessarily able to go to a Yiddish center. And even when you find a Yiddish center like New York, there's not really necessarily an address where you go to meet the Yiddish people. Like, we don't have that. So these immersive gatherings that exist, CLES Canada, the Weimar Festival, the YIVO Zuma program, I think these really underpin this whole cultural, including, I think, that scholarly culture. And I think if those two elements work hand in hand, there's a really nice way to build community and learning.
Yeah. I mean, so we have, I don't know, we've digitized about 5.5 million pages, right? So that's a small fraction of what we actually have here. So you still need to come to YIVO if you're going to do this work. But we understand that because you can just sit at your house and look at the materials online, you're not interacting with scholars, you're not interacting with the archivists. And so we've tried to create, other areas, other ways that researchers can reach us, and we're meeting them where they're at. So we have Zoom appointments for people who are, on the other side of the world. And we have a very robust reference services team now, because there's nothing like talking to a person who is intimately familiar with the collections. So I think that, while digitization facilitates new types of access and new types of research, you still need that kind of connection with a human being.
I think, Cyril, you answered your question in the phrasing of the question. That is to say, the need for some kind of balance. I just want to point out that there's a difference between institutions like the Yiddish Book Center and YIVO and, unfortunately, most universities. Graduate students at universities need to get credit for their courses, and those are usually local, that is, in person. My experience teaching at both the Yiddish Book Center and YIVO has been incredible on Zoom, which I normally don't like, except you get people, from Australia, from South Africa, people are tuning in at 6 in the morning and at 3 in the morning and at 4 in the afternoon, no matter when you're teaching. But you really, the beauty of that is not just that you're getting people from everywhere, but that you're getting people with different perspectives and different relationships to Yiddish from everywhere, which I think has been invaluable all around.
My head is buzzing. It's almost like hearing all of these parshas. A couple of years ago, I thought Yiddish was having a moment. Now it's a full-blown renaissance. My question leads now, what is the next step? We have Jews and non-Jews learning Yiddish. Is there a possibility that there's going to be a 21st century form of literature, of new poems being written, new short stories, new novels by these new Yiddishists?
Alavai. What's the line? I'm going to mess this line up, but not only don't I feel comfortable predicting the future, I'm not so good about predicting the past either. I'm not sure where we're going. I don't think you can predict that. I mean, we want more Yiddish production, yay. I want more Yiddish readers. I'll just say that out front. I really want people access to that material. I'd be delighted if they produced in it, and we're getting people who are producing in it. But for me, as a literary historian, as a literary scholar,
Well,
I-
I'm really focusing on the performing arts. When I was a child, my parents took me to the Yiddish theater on 2nd Avenue. I saw everybody who was anybody.
right, and that is being, and there is Yiddish theater. It's not going to be all over the world, but it does exist. We both have to be realistic about demographics and history and continue producing in Yiddish and in the languages that comment on Yiddish. I mean, yeah.
So, all right. We're supposed to conclude. I see, Jonathan, you raised your hand again. Do you want to make a final comment?
There are many examples of poets who, especially in Poland, who grew up natively speaking Polish but then switched to Yiddish at a certain point. Zuzanna Ginczanka is a good example of this, and that may happen here in the United States at some point.
It has begun to happen in,
Yeah.
In various places from
Right,
people
and
who were-
and Alex Weiser has been writing operas and
Wonderful
all kinds of young creativity that we can't predict the outcome of is continuing.
Well, thank you all for this really great panel and engagement. Can we give them a hand? And I think there is a dinner break, and we reconvene at
7 p.m. And just dinner is on your own, but we will be back at 7. And after the panel at 7, there'll be food served for everyone, drinks, etc. So take a break. We'll see you at 7. Thank you all.